Hi, this is Adam. I'm coming to you again from the campus of the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. This is where my day job is, and I have some thoughts that I wanted to share about the role of data visualization and ways that it can help us kind of in this era that we find ourselves in. We had our second class last night, and one of the discussions that we had was kind of a morale conversation around the fact that expertise and data are not very well received right now, and we are in an era where science and scientific data and factual data are kind of taking a back seat to what people think and believe, and how are we supposed to go about that as data visualizers. And there are a couple thoughts that occurred to me, and these are ideas that my other classes in visualization and practice have also discussed over the last couple of years or so. And a couple thoughts that I wanted to offer, and let me know what you think in the comments. Feel free to share this, because I'd really like to know what you think. The first is that we need to communicate better about how the things that we show through data affect people's daily lives, and we need to do it in ways that are easier to understand and clearer. And so that often involves a choice of measures that are, again, simple and clear, and make sense if you don't have an economics degree or a degree in the natural sciences, a biology degree, or so on. And where this became really apparent is in the last election. There was a lot of discussion about inflation and the impact that higher prices were having on people's lives. And as a lot of you know, after the pandemic, there was a lot of pent-up demand, because people weren't going to work, they weren't driving their cars, they weren't going on vacation, and so on. They weren't buying as many products. So after the pandemic, when people went back to more typical ways of living, all of this pent-up demand was released, and there wasn't enough supply to address that demand. So there were a lot of supply chain issues. There were companies that couldn't manufacture enough, companies that couldn't get enough products to market. So what that meant was prices went up. And a lot of the prices of things that people really need and use in their daily life, like prices for food, prices for gas, prices to heat and cool their houses, went up. And this was due to a lot of other things too. A lot of companies were able to charge more, or needed or wanted to charge more, because they wanted to maintain their margins. So it was a very complex problem. It is a very complex problem. But one of the messaging errors of the Biden-Harris administration was they put a lot of credence into the fact that they had lowered inflation, that inflation went as high as 8 or 9% right after the pandemic, and that they brought it down to something more normal, to more like 2 or 3%. And that's true, but when they would go and they would try to message voters with that, those measures were at odds with people's lived experience. And if you follow a lot of the economic data, then you may know that the typical measure of inflation, which is core inflation, that is usually what you hear reported in the news and that people tend to think of as the measure of inflation, it's called core inflation, doesn't include prices for food or energy because of their volatility. That's the reason given by the Bureau of Economic Analysis for why the core inflation measure is what it is. But what this means is the administration and their surrogates would go out and they would say, well, look, we reduced inflation. We passed this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act that was very successful. But not everybody, not all voters, in fact, most voters don't have an economics degree. Only about 38% of American adults over the age of 25 have a college degree, a 4-year college degree. And only a percentage of those have studied the economics that would teach you about the measure of core inflation and would teach you what inflation actually measures. And so something that I think a lot of people didn't understand is that inflation is just a measure of how much prices increase. So if inflation goes from 9% to 2%, that doesn't mean that prices are not increasing. That just means that they're not increasing as quickly. So I think a lot of voters felt like the administration was kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth. That on the one hand, they were saying, well, inflation is lower, but on the other hand, they were saying, well, yeah, we understand that food is more expensive, and so we want to do things to reduce the price of food, reduce the price of housing, and so on. So when Trump came out and said, well, I don't know what these people are saying, that the price of gas is up 100%, the price of eggs is up 100%. All these prices are doubling or even more. And I'm no fan of Trump's, but that resonated with a lot of people because what the administration was saying is, look, we have controlled prices, we've reduced inflation. But what a lot of voters were experiencing was something very different. And when they were asked the question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? A lot of them said, well, let's see. 4 years ago, it cost me $30 to fill my gas tank. Now it costs me $45. 4 years ago, my weekly grocery bill was $65. Now it's over $100. 4 years ago, it cost me $50 a month to heat my house in winter. Now it costs $95 a month. So these measures that the administration was using to as a measure of success were at odds with people's actual lived experience. And really what that rests on is that they weren't using the right measures. And if they had looked at the right measures of what things actually cost for Americans, they might have had some very different messaging that would have acknowledged, we feel your pain, as it were. We see the issues that you're experiencing in your household economics. So that's one problem. Coming up with measures that non-experts can readily understand and that can be visualized, that you can show in the form of a bar chart or a line chart to say, we see you, we feel you, we acknowledge that the cost of living is much higher than it used to be. The other thing that I think a lot of data visualizers do is they create measures that are kind of at odds with people's lived experience and that aren't really relatable. So if you don't study finance or economics, calling something per capita income. And we as data visualizers probably know what per capita income is. It means the literal income per head, the amount of money per individual in the United States, let's say. But that's not how a lot of people typically experience income. They experience income in terms of the household, right? Because if you have children under 18, they're probably not working. So, to keep it simple, a measure of household income, how much does a typical household make, is more measurable. And if you think of a one income or a two income household, that creates a more understandable and relatable metric. Another thing that might often happen is we use dollar amounts often, and policymakers use dollar amounts a lot to say, well, this particular policy, this particular change in the tax law will mean that the average person will see an increase of $1,000 to their income per year. Well, $1,000, yeah, that's a pretty objective measure, but if we use that measure to be more relatable in terms of how many months of rent, how many months of food, how many filled gas tanks, that makes it become more relatable. So if you say, well, the tariffs that have been put in place will potentially increase Americans' expenses by, and I'm just picking a number out of a hat here, $300 per month. And what does that add up to? That's about $4,600 a year. So $4,600 a year, what does that really mean? Or $300 a month? Well, $300 a month could mean you can or cannot take a vacation. It could mean you can or cannot afford a used car. It could mean that you could fill your grocery cart more. And that makes the measure more relatable. So those are a couple things that I think we can bear in mind as we try to make our visualizations and our statistics more relatable to people. And especially when our audience is pretty broad, that can be a very useful thing. So those are a few thoughts for the week. Please like this if you did like it, comment below if it's interesting, and I'll talk to all of you soon. Thanks a lot.